Hello everyone. Welcome to Roswell Park's third webinar for first responders. Can you believe we're already at 3? It's awesome. Great to see it. I'm Rebecca Vogt. I'm the Media Relations Specialist here at Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center in Buffalo, New York. A big welcome back to some of the station houses and also individuals who have taken part in the last 2 webinars that we've held. And also a big hello to all of you first timers. As we've reiterated in some of our previous webinars, we know that all of you dedicate your lives and so much of your time and energy toward keeping your community safe, and we thank you so much for that. It does not go unnoticed. But at the same time, we want to let you know it is critical to take a step back sometimes and also take charge of your own health. The series so far has shown how your jobs can put you at a significant higher risk for chronic diseases, including cancer, and we look to shed a light on this and offer support and education along the way. Now for today's chat, I am joined by Dr. Jeffrey Burgess. He is a professor and associate dean for research at the Mel and Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health at the University of Arizona. And we'd also like to welcome back one of our standing panelists, Michael Valenti. He serves as the president of the Firefighters Cancer Foundation of New York, and for the last 16 years has been an active member of the Syracuse Fire Department. Mike is on call, so we may also have a guest appearance by Tim Downs also joining us as well in the event that Mike has to peace out and head out on a call. So Dr. Burgess, I'll step aside. Can you tell us first a little bit about yourself and also your work?
Sure. Thank you, Rebecca. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone today. Well, as Rebecca had said, I'm the Associate Dean for Research at the University of Arizona Mel and Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health, and I'm a professor there. And I've been working with the fire service for almost 30 years now in various locations. So previous to this work, I was an emergency doc, a medical toxicologist, and an occupational physician. So I've had the privilege and the honor to work with firefighters in many different capacities, including helping to take care of them previously.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction. Our goal here at Roswell Park is to create comprehensive programs for both screening and treatment of our local and state first responders. And as he just told you, Dr. Burgess is really truly boots on the ground with this topic that we're about to get into today. He specializes in community, environment, and policy, and he also has a concentration on these research projects focused on reducing toxic exposures and preventing illness among first responders. Now, a couple of ground rules just kind of want to throw out there. We're going to leave time open for questions following his presentation, and then also Mike is going to step in, as he has in the last 2 previous webinars, and give a couple of state and regional updates as we wrap everything all up. And also another housekeeping note that you are more than welcome to submit a question through the chat feature down below. Just make sure to send it to all panelists, but there's also an option too if you wish to remain anonymous. There is a way to do that as well, but we welcome any and all questions that come your way, and we're going to try to get to as many as possible. So now I will pass the mic back over to Dr. Burgess, and he will put on his presentation.
Great. No, I appreciate, again, this opportunity to speak with you today. And if we could bring up the first slide. I'm not controlling this, so I'll be saying a lot of next as we move through. So we have a lot of information, and what I thought would be the most useful was really focusing on things that were questions that came directly from the fire service. So I'd like to kind of preface all of this presentation by saying that this is what we in the academic world call community engaged research. And that means that the questions come from the community we're working with. In this case, the community is the fire service. And the fire service takes part in collecting and analyzing the information and also presenting it. So if you want a more entertaining version of the same presentation, you can work with some of my Tucson Fire Department colleagues who do a really good job of presenting this as well and really carrying it out to the rest of the country. So next slide, please. Well, I want to start off with the fact of the matter, which is that there is an increased rate of cancer in the fire service. So not just all cancers put together. I think in that 3-city study, which is that NIAFF study of Philadelphia, Chicago, and San Francisco, you can see on the slide there, there was a 9% increase in all cancers just in the incidence, which means kind of the number of cancers, and about a 14% increase, I believe, in overall mortality from cancers compared to the general population. But more importantly, within that kind of that overall, all cancers mixed together, there were certain ones that popped up that were higher than the general population. And in the case of that 3-city study by Doug Daniels and his crew at NIASH, they had lung, gastrointestinal tract, so that's from the esophagus all the way down to the rectum, kidney, and mesothelioma, which I think a lot of you know is from asbestos exposure, right? And these are all from workplace exposures. Interestingly, you can see there's increases that are substantially above that, the 9 to 14% I just mentioned. Gastrointestinal cancers up, a third or more. Similar to that with kidney cancer at 30, mesothelioma up 100%. That means twofold higher than the general population. Well, they didn't have that many women in the study, but I'll also just point out that in that study, women had bladder cancer rates which were 1,000 times higher, so tenfold higher than the general population. Well, that's one study, 3 cities, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco. These tend to be older cities, right? And a lot of us don't work in those older cities, we work in other places. And there was another study in California that took their cancer registry. So everybody who had cancer in the state of California goes into this registry, and we know who's a firefighter and who's not, and we can compare those things. And what's really interesting here is that the cancers aren't the same. So there are some. The esophageal cancer is up quite a bit, 60% in California as compared to the general population. Kidney cancer is up with just about the same, about 30%. But look at the others. Melanoma, which is a form of skin cancer. Prostate, brain, multiple myeloma, and one form of leukemia, acute myelogenous leukemia. All of those are up, and substantially, 40 to 80% increases. Furthermore, and this is one of the few studies that had enough information to look at minority firefighters, and that was about two-thirds of their minority firefighters are Hispanic, 1/3 Black. They had another 6 cancers that weren't up in the non-minority firefighters. So we don't know why. And before we can adequately prevent cancer, we really have to understand variations among departments and why some people may be more susceptible than others to cancer as well. So these are critical questions. They're not just of academic interest, but the answer to these questions will help the fire service figure out ways of preventing these cancers. Next slide, please. Well, big national statistics are all fine and good. They're very important, for things like workers' compensation, et cetera. But really what drives the fire department and makes it care about cancer is losing one of their own. And this happened in Tucson in 2014 when our fire cause investigator, Tom Kesnell, died of leukemia. He'd spent many years investigating thousands of fires. And you can see here him there with his dog. Interestingly enough, he had 2 dogs that both that worked with him in the fire cause investigation, and both of them died of cancer as well. Well, you can see Tom on the upper left there, kind of when he actually had contracted leukemia, and then you can see a picture of him below in his earlier days. That just happened to be a picture in the paper that was taken for just one fire. And you can see the type of protection he wasn't wearing. So he has gloves, right? He has boots, but he was sniffing for accelerants. So back in those days, fire cause investigators, and still unfortunately in a lot of places, really weren't protecting themselves very much. And I hope you all appreciate that even though you can't see smoke, doesn't mean that there aren't dangerous chemicals in the air. They are. And there were certainly chemicals present in those fires even after the visible flames were put out. So back to Tom, his cancer, leukemia, is one of the primary presumptive cancers for all the states pretty much that have presumptive cancer laws. Benzene causes leukemia. We know that there's benzene at fires, and it should have been an open shut case, but it wasn't. So he didn't get his workers' comp case accepted until after he died. That means that he did not have access to the type of medical care that he should have had. He had just what was covered by his insurance, but not more broadly. And so he was fighting leukemia at the same time he was fighting his workers' comp case. I mean, there was no excuse for this not being accepted, but that's unfortunately the way it is for many states. That can be contrasted with a recent case, which was unfortunately also had a bad outcome, of one of our women firefighters in Tucson who died of cancer. But thankfully, I think because of some of this work that's being done to help demonstrate the links between exposures and cancers in firefighters, her case was immediately accepted and she got the best cancer care that was available. So unfortunately, a bad outcome because she did die, but at the very least, she had the benefit of improved care. So next slide, please. A few things else that are important about these studies too, and actually one final thing about Tom is he talked with from the previous slide. Tom talked with my good friend and colleague Captain John Galata, who's one of our main contacts with Tucson Fire Department and partners in this research, and it was Tom's case that led us to apply to FEMA for much of the work that I'll be presenting to you today. So again, this request for this work came directly because of this unfortunate institute, but Tucson Fire is saying, we got to do something about this. We got to prevent it. We want to do something. Let's talk with the university. Let's get things going. And I would say to all of you, you've got a wonderful cancer center there at Roswell Park. This is the same type of thing that you could be doing, and you probably already are, to answer some of the questions that you care about. So back to IARC. What is IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer? Why do we care? Because all the workers' compensation laws, are gonna be focused first and foremost on the decision by IARC about whether or not something causes cancer. So they decide whether chemicals and occupations cause cancer. Well, unfortunately, right now, they're only saying it's possibly related to cancer. We've still been fortunate to establish all of the cancer presumptive laws in different locations, but they can, they're always subject to threat, and they need to be strengthened. And one of the main links that's missing between, in determination of whether firefighting causes cancer, that could move it from this possibly related, 2B, which is where it is now, to either probably related, which is 2A, or known carcinogenic humans, which is 1, is information about how it is that exposures lead to cancer. And that's one of the things that I'm going to talk with you about today. And we found some really interesting and we believe useful information that can be used by the fire service to both document and help with these cases, and also eventually to help prevent cancer as well. Next slide, please. So based on kind of this lack of information in IARC and Tom Kesnell's death, Tucson Fire Department came to me. So this is John Galata and a fellow captain at the time, Darren Wallentine, who's now John's supervisor and chief. They came to me and said, we want to know when firefighters are being exposed to cancer. So we want to know to cancer-causing agents. So they want to know much more about the exposures, particularly on the fire ground. They also wanted to know how these exposures could lead to disease because of these workers' compensation cases. And of course, and I think all of you would want to know this too, how can we reduce the exposures? So these were the three main questions. And we put into FEMA, and just so if all of you don't know, it's because of the fire service getting together, all the fire service agencies, and asking FEMA to put some money aside for research that has caused all of this research, not just mine, but other people who are speaking with you, to have that research be funded. That has been critical for us moving forward. You are very fortunate that you're working together to do this. And I will say that money, I believe, is being very well spent. You can make that decision yourself, but from my perspective, it's really led to an incredible advance in our knowledge about cancer in the fire service. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go pretty quickly on things, just because otherwise I'll run over. But this was the first question. So when are firefighters being exposed? We thought, because that's what most people thought, that you'd get most of your exposure in the entry teams, right? People going inside burning structures. So that did happen. So if you look at these slides here, you see different categories. You have captains and firefighters that would tend to go into fires, right? You also have engineers and paramedics that tend to be kind of outside of, obviously outside of the structure, and often outside of the hot zone, you know, in a supportive role sometimes. But you also have to realize, and I think you all know, that as an engineer, the wind may change direction, and where you could have been upwind initially, now you could be in smoke. And as I said before, you may not even know that you're being exposed to chemicals if there's not visible smoke. And the same thing with the paramedics, who are primarily, in this case, doing rehab. But we looked at exposures using chemicals that get absorbed into the body. We focused on a set of chemicals that contain known and suspect human carcinogens. That those are the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. And we look at the metabolites of those in the urine. So you get exposed to this both from breathing it in, and particularly if you go on an entry team, it can go right through your skin as well. So the urine measures the combination of what you get breathing in and through your skin. And also think about this, there's a lot of other chemicals, not just PAHs, but if you're getting exposed to PAHs, you're probably getting exposed to a lot of other chemicals on the fire ground. So if you look at we gave you one example here, which is just one of them. That's 1-naphthol. It's a metabolite of naphthalene, which is one of the PAHs. And if you see there in the blue is levels before you go into a fire. So you can also get exposed to these things from eating grilled meat and, you know, a little bit from just general air pollution. But you can see those blue boxes are the majority of the exposures are inside the colored part of the box. And the blue is before the fire, and the red is a couple hours after the fire. And what if you notice, and looking carefully, the engineers are up just as much, if not more, than the captains and the firefighters, and the paramedics are too. So what we found, which was unexpected, is everybody on the fire ground was being exposed, not just the entry teams. Next slide, please. We did a couple of other things. So this hasn't been published yet. It's been submitted. Hopefully it'll be out pretty soon. But we found some other things that we found that we believe can really help the fire service think about these things. And these are consistent with some other studies that were done on controlled fires. Other researchers like Kenny Finn and Gavin Horn had done work where they built structures and burned them. These were actual fires in the community. This is what you are all seeing. We found that for interior response had an increased amount of urinary PAHs as compared to exterior. And furthermore, each minute you spent interior increased your exposure, in this case by 1%. So if you spent 30 minutes interior, your level went up 30% over someone that didn't go interior. Another thing is, and a lot of you guys have been telling me this over the years, when you go to a fire, you smell like smoke for 3 days or so. You know, could be less, could be more, but despite taking showers, you still smell like it. Well, we found that that actually did predict that you had more chemicals in your urine. So that's a real thing. The other things too, and I think hopefully all of you are exchanging hoods daily now, but this was in that early phase before, well, not daily, but after each fire. But these were in those early days when that wasn't being done. And we found that if you hadn't laundered your hood in a while, you actually had increased exposures. So showing that that contaminated hood, even from a previous fire, can still be causing you exposures that get into your skin and into your body, into your urine. And the other thing, interesting enough, that commercial fires actually had lower levels than residential fires. There's a lot of crap in residential houses, you know, plastics, et cetera. And so those are your bread and butter. Those have higher levels of exposures than commercial fires. Next slide, please. So what did they do? They took this information, and Tucson Fire Department, not the University of Arizona, made their decision about what they wanted to do. They did two things. They put their engineers on air, because if you remember, the engineers had very significant increases in their urinary chemicals, the urinary pHs after a fire. So they thought about different things that they could do, and they chose to put their engineers on air. They took those results that I showed you, And they did it, and they went to every firefighter in Tucson Fire Department. And they said, you guys are these, each of those dots, if you remember, there was a bunch of black dots in those graphs. Each of those dots was a person. They said, you're one of these dots. That's you. And they decided, again, that they worked with the engineers, and they said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to try this out. If you're an engineer, you put on your SCBA as soon as you get there. And that's what they did. And in most instances, not 100%, but a lot of people did it. They also, for the fire cause investigators, remember, Tom Kesnell died because of his exposures. Now they have an industrial air pack. They got a variance from OSHA, so they could use an industrial, a lighter weight air pack than the SCBA. And you can see he's got a Tyvek suit on now. Compare that to Tom when he was leaning over with just his boots and gloves, right? Sniffing for accelerants. So big difference now. And they did the whole thing about clean cab as well, and so on. I'll get to that in a moment. But this was kind of these are the main interventions, though, in terms of inhalation. Next slide, please. So for dermal exposures, they did a washdown. I think a lot of you have seen this. Hopefully, a lot of you are doing this. But when someone comes out of the fire, before they take off their SCBA or any of their rest of their gear, they do a washdown. And you can see the differences in the helmets here from on the left, the guys before washdown who are waiting, and the folks on the right. So again, just a little bit of water pressure, Dawn soap. Again, you can get you probably already have protocols like this. If not, you can get them from Tucson Fire Department, Captain John Galata. So they did this. And we wanted, and in addition to this, we did the clean cab, like I said. We actually used wipes on the skin, like the baby style wipes that a lot of you, I'm sure, do. Bagging your gear and either putting in an external compartment or in the cab, but only after bagging it. Showering as soon as possible, hopefully within an hour. And then after each event, laundering the hoods and the turnout gear. So they did all of these things that they hadn't been doing before. And our job was to see, does it make any difference? Next slide. Well, the answer is yes, surprisingly. So again, this is urinary 1-naphthol, but this has been published. So, and actually I need to update this. It has been fully, it's out there, it's open source. You can look at it yourself. And what we found was, in particular, look at the engineers. The blue is before the fire at a baseline. The red is after the fire, before we put these interventions in place. And the white is after we put the interventions in place. If you look at the engineers, for example, that white box is just like the blue box. So it's almost like you didn't go to a fire at all. So it reduced, I think, by around 40% or so when we looked at all the pHs together, someone's exposure, just by wearing your air pack during the event. Simple, right? And the engineers had reasons why they didn't want to do it initially, communication, et cetera, but they were able to do their jobs just fine by wearing it. And again, if you don't trust me, ask the guys at Tucson Fire Department. And if you look, interestingly, there was a reduction in the captains and the firefighters from that, because those boxes are a little bit smaller, a little bit lower down than the white boxes and the red boxes for the captains and the firefighters. Again, a reduction in the range of 30 to 40% just by doing the washdown and those and other events like clean cab, et cetera. So it does make a difference. These were statistically significant, and furthermore, beyond just statistically significant, meaningful in terms of 30 or more % reduction in the exposures. The one, we didn't have enough information on the paramedics, and we hadn't done as much with them, but clearly that's a group that still needs attention. Next slide, please. So we also did, I'm not a sauna, I grew up in Alaska. I'm used to saunas, right? I don't have any problem with saunas, but I wasn't really a fan. I was worried that saunas would be bad for firefighters, and I didn't necessarily want to do a sauna study, but the guys in Scottsdale kind of wore me down. I read, eventually, if any of you know Captain Eric Valliere, excuse me, not Captain, Chief Eric Valliere, you'll realize that he's very good at kind of getting things he wants. So he got us to come up there and do a study with them. Their local bought some infrared saunas from Costco, right? And set one up, and we did their training, and they did 2 evolutions in their training with about maybe 20 to 30 minutes of smoke exposure, fairly heavy smoke exposure. And we took half the guys after they were done. Everybody took a shower. Half of them went through the sauna and half didn't. And we wanted to see, the idea being, if you have lower amounts of chemicals in your urine, that means you probably sweated them out, right? Better sweating them out than having them come into your body. And so the short version of the long story is that the people that went through the sauna did have lower concentrations of chemicals in their urine, suggesting that the saunas may have been helpful, but it wasn't statistically significant. You're going to see this with some research studies. It means that the study needs to be bigger. So we published this as well, along with that other FIREGROUND intervention study, and you can read about it. But what we felt was that we couldn't find any reason that the saunas were dangerous. These are, again, infrared saunas. They did not raise core temperature. They just caused you to sweat more. Weren't working out. These were doing just what Scottsdale wanted to do. So no one was doing exercise in them. But under those conditions, it did not raise the core temperature. It did seem to have some effect on the urinary pHs, but not to a significant degree. So it needs to be done again, but we did not see that they were dangerous. So we told them, if you want to use the saunas like you're doing, we're okay with it. We don't think that it's bad. We can't tell you that it's good. So sometimes research turns out like this. Whereas the ones where we did on the FIREGROUND with Tucson Fire Department, we know that they're effective. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but I just want you to understand that there's different types of biomarkers. One type of biomarker is looking at acute exposures. Those are like urinary PAHs. And so we can tell you acutely whether you got exposed. But we also want to know how those exposures lead to disease. For that, we need to look at what we call biomarkers of effect, not biomarkers of exposure like the urinary PAHs, but biomarkers of effect. So what are we going to use that's associated with an exposure but could lead to an increased risk of cancer? So what we chose to do, we can do the next slide. The next slide, there we go. We chose to look at epigenetic changes. So before you fall asleep, let me try to explain this in a way that hopefully makes sense. So a genetic change is a change in your DNA. That'd be heritable, like your kids would get it, et cetera. And that's not a good thing to have, but we hadn't been seeing those as much, at least in previous studies of firefighters. So the other thing that hadn't been looked at were epigenetic changes. These are changes in the DNA molecule, but that aren't involved in the change in sequence. And what that does, you actually methylate the DNA, for example. You actually turn on or off gene expression. Think of that as being a light switch. And there are 2 types generally of genes, ones that promote cancer, which are called oncogenes, and ones that protect you against cancer, those are called tumor suppressor genes. So if you turn on an oncogene, you're going to increase your risk of cancer. If you turn off a tumor suppressor gene, you're going to increase your risk of cancer. So we looked at those. We also looked at microRNAs. These are all measurable in the blood. And these are things that can also act, the individual microRNAs, is oncogenes promoting cancer or tumor suppressors protecting you. Next slide, please. So we started by comparing incumbents to new recruits. Now, there are differences in age, but we can adjust for that statistically. And what we found comparing the incumbents to the new recruits was, and in Tucson, almost all of our new recruits had never been a firefighter before. So some departments, you bring them in, they've already been firefighters. In Tucson, it's not the case. So they're just like firefighters, except they're younger, right? Because they're going to become firefighters really soon. And we got them before they did any live fire training. And that's, I think, again, a very powerful way of doing this analysis. We found changes in the pathways of DNA methylation comparing the 2 groups that were associated with increased risk in abdominal cancers, colon cancers, skin cancers, and lung cancers. Some of those same cancers that we reported from that 3-city study done by Doug Daniels in Philly, Chicago, San Francisco and that study of firefighters in California. Next slide, please. We also looked at the microRNA, and this actually, I still can't believe that it came out this way, because usually things aren't so clean in science. So what we found was that if these are all the microRNAs on the left-hand side, you can see there's a black line through it. All those things that are above that black line were decreased in the incumbents compared to the new recruits. Everything that was below that line was increased in incumbents as compared to new recruits. That FC is a fold change. So, you know, that if it's below 1, again, it's going down. If it's above 1, it's going up. So of all the things that went down in the incumbents, they were all tumor suppressors. And you can see on the right the specific cancers that those are known to be associated with in studies done in the general population. We still haven't got to see what these things predict in firefighters. That's a long-term study. I'm going to talk about it with you soon, about how we're in the whole firefighter cancer cohort study. But this is just telling us that these markers are useful. The other thing is, of the 2 of the 3 things that went up were oncogenes. So again, all of those increase the risk of cancer in the incumbent firefighters. Next slide, please. So, you know, that's all fine and good, but how do we turn that into something that can help us identify increased risk of cancer that we can do something about before cancer occurs? So to do that, we need to turn these studies into what we call a prospective cohort study. That means a cohort is just a fancy scientific word for group. Prospective means you're going forward over time. All those studies that you saw that I presented at the beginning were retrospective studies. We looked at people who already had cancer or compared them to other people that didn't. This is looking at people before they develop cancer, and again, sometimes as early as new recruits. What we wanted to do was to have this large prospective multi-center, because there's differences, like I showed you, all around the country, focused on the exposure side and the effect side. And what we do is we ask surveys, or all online surveys, we do them through little iPads, collect blood, urine, and buccal cells. And these have been supported by FEMA through a number of grants. And we just are hoping, we've heard some positive initial information, but don't have final word on some new grants for this year as well from FEMA. Next slide, please. So I love my firefighter colleagues, because they say things in really nice and clear ways that, you know, just don't always occur to me. So one of them is Lieutenant Charlie Pott from Boston Fire Department, and that's not too far from Framingham. So if any of you have kind of paid a lot of attention to cardiovascular disease, you may have heard of the Framingham Heart Study. So it started back in the 40s, when we knew that particularly men were dying of heart disease, but had no idea why. So does that sound familiar? Just like the firefighters, we know they're dying of cancer, but we don't know why. So he said, is this like and I don't do a Boston accent, so you'll have to get Charlie to do it. But is this like a Framingham heart study for firefighter cancer? And I go, yeah, that's it. So this is the same idea. By following people over time, we'll learn things. Like in that case, we learned the importance of cholesterol. We didn't know about how bad, about your diet and having too much fatty foods, etc. We didn't know that then, but we do now. That's where we want to get to. Next slide, please. So we've been really lucky to get funding from FEMA, and we also have now some additional funding from, and actually this first 3 were from FEMA, the framework study that's already been finished, expansion study, which Dr. Alberto Caban Martinez from University of Miami, who's a colleague of mine, and a co-lead of the firefighter cancer cohort study, has got that grant. We have another one looking at PFAS chemicals. I'll talk about those today if we have time, but if not, maybe I can go back some other time. And we have a study funded by NIOSH with WUI, where the guys in LA County and Orange County Fire Authority in California are actually collecting the urines themselves and actually recruiting firefighters themselves to be part of this study. I talked about community engaged research, and I mean it. Next slide, please. So we have a lot of academic partners NIAFF is part of this too. I wanted to just point out a few things. One is that we have an oversight and planning board that's run by the fire service. So if any of you know Casey Grant, who is formerly the executive director of the Fire Protection Research Foundation, right? The nonprofit research organization affiliated with NFPA. So he runs that, but he has all the major fire service organizations within that, and they look over the study and guide us. We also we collect these bloods and urine and buccal cells so we can analyze them. If some new marker comes up later on, we've got them stored, can look at them. I'm running that part. The Data Coordination Center, all the data in the surveys, run by Dr. Alberto Caban Martinez from University of Miami. And then the exposure, oops, I think this was a little bit wrong. I didn't check the slide here. There's 2 biomarker centers. There should be an exposure analysis center here. Sorry, I didn't pick that up. That's run by NIOSH. Was run by Kenny Fent, now by Dr. Miriam Calkins. But the heart and soul of this are the different fire service organizations and departments and unions, locals. All of those are kind of in those different states, and we actually have additional states. For example, we're working with the airport in Anchorage, so Alaska should be on there too, and so on. Next slide, please. So I just want you to think about all the questions that you could answer using this. So we've looked at current exposures, right? We've looked at those like for the urinary pHs. We're also looking at flame retardants. We're looking at PFAS chemicals. We can measure those in blood. We can tell you what the exposures are. The idea of these things, of the epigenetics, is they're reversible. So if we can figure out how to change them before you get cancer, that's a big plus. And that's something we're working towards. More importantly, there's a latency period between when you get exposed and when you get cancer that's as short as 3 years for some cancers and over 35 years for others. So we don't want to wait 30 plus years to figure out whether this intervention is effective. We can use these markers to figure out if what we're doing is working. We are also now starting to explore using screening tests to help identify who should be going in for actual things like low dose, high resolution CT scan, or maybe whole body MRI. So we're working with a cancer center in Phoenix right now on that now. And you can look at other endpoints. For example, we hope to get a study where we're looking at reproductive health in female firefighters and male firefighters for that as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to stop here because that was a load of information. Happy to take any questions you've got, and then if we have time, we'll cover a little bit more about PFAS. But I figured it would take me a while, and it has, as usual, to get through this first part.
All right, well, Dr. Burgess, just a couple things first. Very interesting that the initial partners for one of the cohorts is Korea. How did that get on? How did they get on board? That was just sort of a question for me. I saw that pop up on the slide. Yeah,
so it was interesting. So I was sitting in my office one day, and one of my students brought in, he was a Korean student, and he brought in one of his professors from Korea. And so we had a really nice conversation. And then, there was a meeting in Korea, and I was presenting, and she brought one of her fellow faculty members along with her and said, can she come and work with you in the US? I said, absolutely. So that was Dr. Kyung-Suk Jeong. She published one of the papers. They actually, they have their own cohort study that they're doing with Korean firefighters, and we share information. And they did something which is fascinating, where they were looking at different shift structures and found that based on the different type of shifts you have worse outcomes in terms of some of these markers. So they're doing stuff that we haven't even got to yet. But it's been a great collaboration. She's been a great person to work with.
That is utterly fascinating, and to know that they are, doing things, kind of jumping ahead, you know, a couple of steps in the game sort of thing. I'm sure it's going to be interesting to continue collaborating with them a little bit more. One question I want to go to, and kind of goes back to a couple slides prior, and I was talking about the wash down, and I know you had mentioned Dawn dish soap. Are there any other you know, preferred cleaning solutions or anything else that you could recommend in terms of trying to reduce the carcinogenic particles on some of the turnout gear?
So I want everyone to know I have no commercial interest. They don't own stock, and whoever runs Dawn, I don't know what company that is, but that's just what Tucson Fire chose. You know, it works pretty well. I'm sure a number of dishwasher or dish soap detergents would work just as well. But we feel that these things are, you know, fairly low cost. It doesn't take much. We don't know that anything fancy in terms of decontamination solutions are needed. But you do need to, you know, the pHs are kind of sticky, so you do need to kind of you know, wash them off with soap and water with a brush too. And again, the SOPs are available from Tucson Fire Department. A number of you may have ones as well too, but they're very happy to share them.
Great. Mike, I mean, do you have anything to add on that end of, you know, what do you guys do to do the wash down? Mike, okay, cool.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute there. You know, this is something we're starting to get into more and more. And I know our training division is working on this to get, you know, the supplies we need and teach us the right way. It's just tough sometimes to figure out the right methods to use and the right products to use. You know, what's beneficial and what's more harmful to us. So, you know, that's why we're looking to the experts to say, you know, without being a sponsor for somebody, you know, for a product, give us the information on what's best that's out there. Some of these wipes we have are actually more cancer causing and dangerous to us than beneficial. So it's a lot of research, and we're looking to the experts to give us those answers.
Great, thank you for that, Mike. One coming in through the chat right now. I would love to hear if there are devices or equipment that are not yet covered by AFG SAFER and or FEMA grants, but you feel would make a real difference in the safety of our firefighters and first responders.
So I would say that I can't answer that completely, and I'm sure that there's other people out there. And again, I would, if you have not met Kenny Fenton, then you should, and he'd be a good person to talk. And then there's, as I mentioned before, Dr. Gavin Horn, who's now in Oregon, but he was with the Illinois Fire Service Institute. And they've been doing some very good work looking at specifics, for example, the particle blocking hoods. And we looked at one early on that was a kind of a beta model, and it didn't work. But that was just one, it was early stage. So I think this idea of particulate blocking hoods is probably a good idea, because the old ones, the particles and everything could go right through. But Dr. Horn would be the one he's doing that work right now. So that would be one thing. The whole idea of how clean is clean and washing your gear when you get back afterwards using extractors or whatever, right? There's also another group there that is working on to answer those questions. So I think that's, you know, another piece of equipment. But I'll get back to the gear. One thing that there, and I believe there's research going on, it might be North Carolina State that's working on this, but the gear, the problem is gear is meant to protect you. I'm talking about, you know, the turnout gear is meant to protect you from heat, and it does that pretty well. But the particulate can get right up inside of it, particularly around the wrist and around the legs. And I think you see, probably a lot of you have seen pictures of that fluorescent, you know, when they simulated fire, fluorescent dye getting onto people. Well, in some of our training fires, particularly with gear that wasn't perfect fitting, you could just see soot all over the legs of the firefighters. I mean, it was so clear. So getting improved gussets, for example, that might protect that, I think that'll be really important. We need to make sure it works first. So as Mike said, I'm a strong believer in making sure that something works before you buy it. So just wait for the research to come out to show that it's effective. And if it is, I think that would be the way to go.
All right. I have sort of a twofold question coming in. I'll ask the first part and then we can get to the second part. Can you talk at all about the role of routine or enhanced cancer screening in firefighters? Are there any direct benefits?
Well, I would say that that's an area that we need to be looking more into, and we don't have all the data back. And I would, at the very least, firefighters should be doing what's recommended for the general public. And the reason I start there is you'd be surprised how many firefighters have not gotten colonoscopy or done some other screening for colorectal cancer and they're over 50. I mean, that's silly. I mean, you have to have that one way or the other. There's a number of different ways to screen for it, and they're not all colonoscopy, but colonoscopy is, I think, a good, solid, proven way. You can look at, occult blood testing in various forms, et cetera. I mean, there's ways that can be done. So that's where I think they could work with, Roswell Park and make sure that at the very least you're doing what the general population should be doing, because we've had a number of firefighters die from colorectal cancer, and they can get it much earlier than 50. So I personally feel that they should be screened at least 40 and maybe even earlier if we have, if we're finding a significant number of cases before then. So that's one, that's just an obvious one. Skin cancer, up in the fire service, easy to look for, right? So having a dermatologist look at you, that's a no-brainer. It should be done. Now for other things like, when do you get a CT scan to look for lung cancer? Should you be using things like whole body MRI, et cetera? Those are really expensive. I don't know that we have enough information on that about when it should be done. We're hoping long-term to have some test that we can look at to identify cancer really early in the body, or that leads us to believe that you might have it, that then you could go in for this more, extensive, expensive screening, but with a greater likelihood of finding something. So those are, again, some things we know you should get, and each department should really be talking with some oncologists in their region as well as their own OCDOCs to figure out what's right for them.
And that's why we're here, and that's basically the basis of all of our webinars too. I mean, it's so crucial to have that connection, not only to your primary care doctor, but then also to, the oncologists at places like Roswell Park, and of course all over the country, all the other, cancer centers and comprehensive cancer centers out there. It is just so crucial, and to have have a conversation too, because I'm sure, there's a lot of people who try to, put off these things about their health. So yes, thank you. I just hit mute for a reason. I don't know why I did that. I will shift over to another portion of this first part of your presentation. How does one get involved with the firefighter cancer cohort study? Can anyone in this, who's tuning in today, take part? How do we make that happen?
Well, we've been working on this very issue, trying to figure out how to get to where we want to get to. So our goal for the firefighter cancer cohort study was to have 10,000 firefighters in the study. We're probably around 1,200 or so now, I think. We have a long ways to go. And there's only, we apply for funding from the federal government. We've been reasonably successful so far, but we really need to take it past that. And I think we're looking at all options. We're even looking, one of our partner departments or one of the departments who wants to partner with us is actually, for example, going to talk with local donors to see if they can't help support bringing the department in. So I think we look at it as a big tent. So it's not just University of Arizona, University of Miami. We recently had Dr. Judith Graber from Rutgers, that's in New Jersey. She's going to be bringing volunteer firefighters into the study. So she's been able to get some additional funding. She hopes to get more from her state, for example. And as another example, in Florida, they've gotten funding from their state every year to fight cancer. I mean, that's great. They can do a lot of stuff with that. So there's a number of different ways of being able to do that. One of the main things that we're also looking at is, even with our existing funding, can we get departments to recruit their own firefighters? So can they go ahead and bring them in, and both new recruits and incumbents? And we're doing that, as I mentioned, LA County is doing that right now. we're in COVID. We can't travel very well, right? They're telling me I can't travel out of state on business unless I've got a really, compelling reason, and just research, unfortunately, is not, even though it's as important as this. So in LA County, they're recruiting their own trainers. They're going to want to look at their own trainers. So we can send them the blood tubes and everything else, and they can do it. So these are all different ways. And I also recommend, as you said, Rebecca, I'd love to have people talk with Roswell Park and figure out maybe Roswell Park has got some donors. If they don't themselves know somebody, they could help bring or sponsor fire departments and bring them in, and we could all work together, because we're really a big tent here and we need everyone, pulling together.
Mike, did you want to chime in with something?
Yes. Right now, looking at everybody that's watching this, we have a large contingency of Syracuse firefighters. When you look at some of the names, there's probably 3 or 4 or 6 or 7 firefighters watching together. Wondering how many of us and the Buffalo firefighters that are involved in this would be willing to be a part of a study. And we have such a unique area up here that we may get a lot of discoveries that are consistent with this area. We also have some retired firefighters that were also down at 9/11. So, if you're willing to be a part of something, contact myself or Ashley, and we can figure this out to get our own study and look at our own group.
Fantastic. Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
No, I was going to say, this is what we love. I mean, that's exactly the way we need to build the study. And furthermore, I mentioned it a few times, but it's worthwhile saying it again. Ask your own questions. What is the question that you care about that you're going to do something about? You saw what Tucson did, right? That you saw their information. The folks in LA County and Orange County, they were collecting urine after WUI fires, right? Wildland urban interface, which unfortunately is starting up again. Their season, as you know, is already starting up. So they want to know how much they're getting and what they're doing when they get it so that they can make choices. So that's the acute exposure side. They want to know if their trainers are worse off than everybody else for some of these epigenetic markers. That's another question they want to answer. So don't just say, hey, I want to be part of a study, although we love it, but say, we want to be part of a study and we care about this, this, and this.
Yeah, and Dr. Burgess, I just want to add in that, it is our goal here at Roswell, to be a partner with this study. So I know, we got to get, the connections moving and everything, but I mean, it is our goal. Don't just think that, and everyone tuning in, don't just think that these webinars are, just smoke and mirrors. Like, we are getting stuff done, and there's things in motion. So just to kind of share that with everyone out there. One other thing, I think, as we kind of get near to wrapping up, I want to ask about this. Now, you saw clearly that there were a couple of inner station department sort of policy changes in that sense, with how to do washdowns and that sort of thing. But has any of the research led to sort of legislative changes? I know that stuff we do here with some of our tobacco research leads lawmakers to pass things about e-cigarettes and vaping. Is there anything that you have done and anything that has come out there that has led to some big governmental changes?
So when you have legislative changes, that again takes everyone pulling together. And I would say that our fire departments, particularly the professional firefighters of Arizona, the PFFA, but also the Arizona Fire Chiefs, and got together and got legislation, worked with their legislators, got legislation to expand the cancers in the presumptive law. So we had an initial set, and then they were expanded, and we presented our work to help support that. So that provided some of the additional scientific underpinning to help convince the legislators to pass it, and they did. So there was one example. We were trying, and we have not been successful as of yet, to actually force the presumptive part to actually function as envisioned, so that if you fit the criteria, that's a checkbox and you get your case. That's been a harder one to crack, but we have been supporting it through our work. But we also hope that our work, based on our work, Partly, not entirely, but again, it's everybody pulling together. I mentioned IARC, if everyone remembers, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. They said it was possibly related. Our work is helping to support the firefighting being revisited by IARC. And so I know for a fact that our mechanistic data was used to help support being revisited. So things are being put off by COVID, of course, but they are going to revisit this in the next 3 to 4 years, and we'll have additional data, and this data will help. And if we can change IARC, you're going to see a lot of different, that will flow down to a lot of different places.
If I could add on to this also, Dr. Burgess, you and I had talked down in Miami before, and one of the things that we were so close on was getting these screenings that we talked about at the earlier ages and get it required. Before this whole COVID, we were, I think, almost as close as possible to get it here on a city and county level, and then working with Roswell to get it on a state level to make it a mandate that every firefighter gets their colonoscopy earlier. And that's something I feel, and our group feels, that is a priority. And as soon as we can get the politicians back and get their ear again, we need to have a united front to come through and get this done. We just got a notice from a firefighter in Syracuse here that 49 years old was diagnosed with stage 4 through his lungs, diaphragm, lymph nodes, and he had no prior symptoms. If there could have been some sort of earlier screening for him, could his outcome have been different? So, this is what we're fighting for. This is what we're pushing for.
I think I agree entirely with you, Mike. That's important. I would also say that, I mentioned that clinic in Phoenix. It's called the Vincier Cancer Center. So it's not like a really huge cancer center like Roswell Park or the one that we've got here at University of Arizona. But it's run by a really wonderful person. Her name is Dr. Vaishali Shukla, and she's been working with Phoenix Fire Department, and she's been screening their firefighters using the best in screening. And she can give you some of the results that she's had in terms of the cancers she's found in young firefighters. I think that information would be really helpful for you as you move forward. Just, this is real data from what advanced, very high quality screening, Cadillac screening can give you.
I think we can eke in one more question before we wrap things up. One coming in of what's the average funding needed to per firefighter to be involved in a study?
Well, that depends on what you want to do. So we actually have available, and you can contact me or Casey Grant, as I mentioned, who's kind of moving this forward. We actually put some numbers together. So if you want to just collect samples, it's probably a couple hundred. I can't remember the exact number. Less than 500, per firefighter to get everything together. But now if the firefighters collect it themselves, that'll be lower, right? Because that means we don't have to fly out from Arizona or Miami or something to go there and have all our costs there. So we can reduce that. And then each of these analyses has different costs. The amount, I think, for the DNA methylation is around 200 or so, I think. And then for the microRNA is maybe like 400. So, and each of the pHs in the urine is a lot less than that. So, it depends on what you want to do.
And needless to say, it could greatly benefit from grants and the generous, philanthropic communities across the United States, not only in Arizona, in Buffalo and Syracuse and beyond, a lot of times to get some of this stuff off the ground. 1 more minute kind of remaining. Any sort of wrap up thoughts from either of you?
I would say, and I think predominantly firefighters in the audience. And so it's just for me, thanking all of you for the things you do for keeping us safe. And it's been a privilege, it's been an honor to work with the firefighters. I have so far. You're just a fantastic group to work with. And I think it's really our job as academics, as cancer center personnel, et cetera, to help support you. So, you know, because of the things you do, and it also works for us too, because you're protecting us. So thank you.
Mike, anything from you?
Well, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Burgess. You know, I approached him on the floor at the Miami Cancer Symposium and asked him to do this, and I think within 20 minutes he had a presentation already written out for me and sent over, and you know, for me to review. Like I said, I can't thank him enough, and I can't thank Roswell enough for doing this for us. I hope this message gets out to more people, and the next presentation we do, we double our attendance. But today, you know, we look at the numbers and they're phenomenal, and we're excited this is going on, and thank you.
Mike, anything you want to add just about a survey for future topics?
Yes, you know, this is our third installment of this. The next one we're going to get into some of the skin cancers and screenings and stuff. But we want to know what, you know, our viewers and the people watching this, you know, what topics they might have that are specific. You know, we're kind of broad a little bit on our topics to bring it all in, but we want it to generate more webinars in the future. So if there are things that you want us to talk about, just send us an information. You can email me. Again, we've said it before. My email is mvalenti@ffcancer.org. If you have topics and you want them brought up, please email me. Let me know, and we'll get it to Roswell, and we'll get it set up. All right?
Fantastic. All right. Yeah. Open all eyes and ears to any and all suggestions you guys may have. So thank you again, Dr. Burgess, for joining us today. And as always, Mike, it's a pleasure to see you on here as well. And thank you to everyone who has tuned in. Now, if any of your burning questions weren't answered, or once we end this, you say, oh, darn, I really should have asked that, we do encourage you to, again, you know, write in those topics and also tune into our future webinars. They're going to continue to address even more of these topics and questions you may have. So we have the First Responders resource page, and that's at roswellpark.org/first-responders. And you can get updates on there for what's coming up next. Also, the video from today will be available to view on that on demand, or excuse me, it'll be available to view on demand on that page. Excuse me, getting a little bit tongue tied here. And the link is also going to be sent to your email. Please also stay tuned to roswellpark.org/first-responders webinar. That's the landing page for all of these webinars, and also your email to register for any and all that are coming up in the near and dear future. With that all being said, everyone, we wanted to thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and we'll see you again next time. Bye, everyone.